Wow.
In the South, they were the colonel was given a stipend of money to hire 4 laundresses. The requirements for becoming a laundress were: 1, you had to be married to one of the men in the unit, which is about 100 men. You had to have a physical first to make sure that you didn't have any diseases and that you were strong enough to do the work, because this is difficult work. And then you had to go to the commanding officer and have an interview with him to make sure you were a lady of good character. So those were the requirements. Then for that, they gave you a sidewall tent. You got the same rations as a man, and you got $9 is what about a private earned. And realize you're sharing this tent with 4 women, plus any small children they may have. Most of the reasons that they became laundresses: 1, they were burned out of their farms, had no farms to work, no place to go. They either had nobody to work the farm may not have been burnt down, but they had nobody to work the farm, couldn't do it on their own, or they simply wanted to be with their husbands. And as a family unit as much as possible. The husbands were allowed to come and visit the family, so that made it very nice and wonderful. Most of this takes, this is a 4-day process. First the day the officers and soldiers will bring you their clothing. You'll sit down with them, go through it, make sure there's laundry marks on all their clothing. You'll make sure that they have all the buttons are sewn on, and you'll repair any holes that are in it. You'll write it in your book, because you want to get paid later. You would write it in your book, have them initial what you did. So that night you're going to soak them in hot water. 90% of the men had lice. So you didn't want to work on the clothes too much if they were full of lice. So the drawers and the socks were one thing you wouldn't have sewn on until after they were laundered. So you would go ahead and do that. And this pan would be, the next day you would end up putting this over a fire up, and it would be boiling water. And you would boil it and boil it, boil it. And then you would use the molly sticks to take it from the boiling water into a hot water pan. You would scrub them here and then scrub them again. So they got 2 scrubbings. One's for the minor dirt, and then the second scrubbing would be for if you had any serious spots or stuff that you still didn't get out. So it would be a chance to recheck it. But this water is really hot, so you want to get through as much as you can. That one's a little cooler, so you can really look and get it done. Then, while they were doing this one would be emptied and started boiling water again. So you had a rinse cycle and a wash cycle. And then you would hang out the clothes and let them dry overnight. Then the next day, everything got a starch. A light starch, a medium starch, or a heavy starch, but everything got a starch, because when you starch things, you can almost just brush the dirt off. So as a protection, so here's your clothes, here's your starch, and here's your dirt. So as it soaks overnight, that starch releases, and so does most of the dirt. So that made it much easier to wash and keep everything clean. Then you would go ahead the next day, after it's starched and it's dried, that evening you would sprinkle everything, get it moist, and put it in a tub, and then the next day you would go ahead and iron everything. Now everything had a starch, so one of the things that you had to watch for was, these were the irons. This one's kind of pitted and not smooth on the bottom. This one would not iron very well. You wanted to make sure your irons were smooth on the bottom. But have you ever held one of those?
Wow.
And that's only a 6-pounder. Oh, that's the 9-pounder rather. Sorry. So I have a 6, a 7, and a 9-pounder. They went up to 22 pounds, but they ironed the big irons like that. They used in the city on big sheets. We would use them on a big floor. But have you ever heard the term "too many irons in the fire"? That came from this period of time. Because if you had 3 or 4 irons going and you picked the wrong iron, you just ruined 3 days of ironing, because you picked up one that was too hot and you scalded your clothes. So you didn't want to have too many irons rotating at the same time. So, and if you have 3 or 4,
too long, it'll get hot.
Right, and if you had 3 or 4 laundresses all doing the same thing, it's very likely you could pick up one that, the other person had just sat down, and you could pick up the other one. So it was very likely that happened, but mostly you had your own area, and so you didn't, or your own pan on the fire or whatever, so you knew which ones were your irons.
So one person would do all this that you're describing?
Or you would work as a team. Usually they chose one of the women to be kind of the boss, and she would kind of rotate everybody. Sometimes that worked, and sometimes it didn't, and sometimes one says, I'm doing my own thing, and, But you worked as a family, too. A lot of your children, if you had children with you, everybody did something. If you had boys that were the right age, they would go ahead and tend the fire. They would get the water. If you had young children, a 3-year-old might be taking care of a 2-year-old. It all depended on what you had and what you could do and what worked. And the girls would be learning how to sew. If you didn't have any daughters the right age, you might be teaching the boys how to sew. Because all these things, you could earn extra money. And if you were a good laundress with a helping family, you could earn $35 to $40 a month. $9 didn't go very far, especially if you had to feed a family and you had to buy all your own supplies. So it worked out pretty good.
Wow.
So how would you protect your hands?
You didn't. You washed really well. Because this is lye soap. I use lye soap here. And so I always have the kids wash and rinse their hands afterwards because it's rough. And their hands would often be red and very chafed. And also they would also have lots of burns here on their arms and on their fingers.
From the irons?
From the irons. You learn real quickly to use a hot pad and use it correctly. So, yeah. And these are some of the products that they used. They had commercial bleach, but it wasn't always the same strength, so they would have to test it. They had to know how to read, write, do math, so you didn't get cheated. So they had to be very smart women. Plus they had to know almost how to be a chemist as well. So, and they made their own potato starch. This is what's on the clothes, is potato starch. And so they had to know how to do those kind of things. They could make their own soap, but your chances of being there long enough to get the soap made before you had to move was not very good. So if you could buy it, you would. It would save you more time. Plus all the equipment it took to make the soap would be, a lot extra stuff to take, where if you were on a farm or something, you wouldn't have to move it all the time. So, and then there's the term, have you ever heard the term extra baggage? That also came along at this time. If you figure you got all the sleeping gear for 4 families, all the cooking gear for 4 families, all the laundry stuff, plus your tarp and your tent, that's a lot of baggage. And you wanted to get it on the next train or wagon that was going to go to the next place. So as soon as they saw the laundresses coming up with their gear, they would say, oh no, here comes the extra baggage. So they weren't too thrilled to have to. But then they wanted their clothes washed, so
Right.
can't
You
have
it both ways.
And quite often, we would be situated near the officers, not in the same area as them, but close to them. And quite often they would have the women do the cooking, hire them as cooks too. That freed up a man to do something else so that he wouldn't have to be doing just the cooking for the colonel and his staff. So, double duty.
Wow, interesting stuff.
Thank you for sharing that. It's
Oh,
great.
Yeah.
And the beeswax was saved. They were thrifty women too. They would save the beeswax from their candles. And one of the things they got in their rations was pork and bacon. And so that gives you a lot of grease. So what they would do is take the candle wax, if you got a large spot of grease, and melt it, pour it on there, and then you could iron it between brown paper and move your paper around until it was nice and clean. And you knew you got all the grease and all the oil out that you were going to get.
Oh. Do you ever try that trick today?
I used it with my grandmother when I was young. So, and it worked. So, yeah.
Never heard of that.
I haven't used it in a long time, but when my grandmother was, when I was around my grandma, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So, they don't have deodorant, so they used vinegar, and they would use it under the armpits and in the groin area on clothing. So it helped with the bugs a little bit, along with the odors.
Wow.
And what was the chalk for?
The chalk was for grease as well. What they would do is make it into a powder, put a little bit of water with it, put it on a small grease stain, and it would absorb the grease.
I see.
Yeah. So, and then they had steel wool and alcohol they would use to polish the buttons, and also to get the rust off the uniforms. Worked very good. And it was considered inappropriate to have yellow undergarments, so they would go ahead and put bluing in the wash, in the rinse cycle. They would add maybe 3 to 4, and if it was past that, then it was not worth doing it anymore. So, but it would make it more of a gray-white, which was considered acceptable. So, yeah. It's really good. And then the officers drank a lot of wine. It wasn't the wine like we have today. It was more a grape juice, but a potent grape juice. So what they would do is if they spilt wine on their shirt or on their linen tablecloth, they would take salt, put it on there when it's damp, and it'll absorb the color out of the tablecloth. So that worked really well.
Very neat.
All right. Well,
Okay.
thank you so much.
That's
You're
great.
welcome.
Yeah.